Hello and welcome to episode number 8. My name is Torsten Tauble, and today I am going to be talking about a question. And the question is, what's right about you, or what's right about me that I'm not getting? And so it was interesting. This particular question is actually in the foundation manual, and I played with another one that's very similar, and that is what's right about this that I'm not getting. And this one, I swear, I've never heard it before. And it just kind of showed up. And so I've actually been playing with it, and it's really interesting because what I have actually noticed is that whenever something comes up, probably the first place I go is actually what's wrong about me that I'm not getting. Like that is really the default. And I know I've talked about this one before, this question and sort of where we go, but it's really been interesting in the last while, like playing with that question and really looking at at me as not a wrongness, and that seems to be the place that I really end up going. And it is so fascinating to also be aware that I do that. And there's been a few situations lately where it has been interesting, and I'll give you one example. One example, actually, I was driving somewhere, and I rear-ended somebody, and I haven't been in an accident in many years. And so, guess where the first place I went? What's wrong about me that I'm, yeah. And so I went into total judgment of myself right away. And it was really interesting just to look at that, just to see that that's kind of the default. That's just where I go. And it wasn't about, there wasn't this, in that moment anyways, there wasn't this question of what's right about me that I'm not getting. Because of course, if you do something like that, like you automatically go into that you did something wrong. And quite dynamically, actually, it was really interesting to see how dynamically I went into what was wrong about me. How come I wasn't paying enough attention, and I should have been, and I always do, and I normally am on it right away, and I'm, situations like that don't come up in my world. And I mean, there was a list, and it was quite impressive. And it wasn't until a little bit later that I actually was willing to ask some questions and then look at it. And it is so interesting where, in this case, it was so obvious to see how quickly and how dynamically I went to what was wrong about it, the whole thing. And it was really interesting to see. Like, that was really an interesting awareness for me to see in my world, where just how fast I went there, and really being aware of that isn't really necessary to do, and that we can choose something else. And instead of going there right away and contracting, and it was also interesting just to see the the going into this, like, where it's almost like you shut down, or this is kind of what I did, and it wasn't really a shutting down per se necessarily, but it was definitely a contraction of me. And 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 as you probably can get a sense of what that is, where you just like, you just go dynamically into judging yourself for being wrong for this particular situation that occurred. And so that was just one of the things that kind of brought this question forward. And it's just so interesting how you can see where you do this in your life. And the cool thing about this is that I became more aware, and or I was more acknowledging that I was doing it as I was doing it. I still didn't change anything, but I still acknowledged that I was doing it. And so it is really quite interesting on how much that still is the first place that I go. And I realize that, hey, I'm not the only one that does that. I realize that we all tend to do that fairly well, actually. We're kind of professional making ourselves wrongers in some sense. And it's like, what if we actually didn't choose that as our first choice? Or wasn't the first place that we went to make ourselves wrong for just about anything? And so I'm really actually grateful for that situation. As strange as it may seem, I got a lot of awareness out of it. It was probably one of the most recent places most recent situations where I made myself so dynamically wrong for it. And so it was really a good reminder, and it was really good to see how much in that particular situation, how much that showed up for me, and how much you can change it. Like, you really, really can. And it's actually also so beautiful. It was beautiful for me to see that when you go into the question, what that can create in all parts of our lives. And it's so interesting to see that when you don't, I notice so much now when I don't go into question what that creates in my life. And the other thing that's really been interesting lately too is also how much do you actually go into question, or how much are you actually the question in your life that you don't acknowledge that you actually do, that you actually are that. And that's something that's been really interesting for me too, that has been showing up, is just realizing in many areas of my life how much I actually have been in the question. And that really is this question of what's right about me that I'm not getting. It's fascinating what actually shows up. And so I had been asking this question quite a bit, actually. And one place that it did show up for me was with my body, actually. And what was interesting was it actually came out of, I was reading one of Gary's most recent books that he wrote called The Home of Infinite Possibilities. So I've been reading that at nighttime, not too much, but a few pages every night before I go to bed. And so I was reading about it, and the conversation in there was talking about being owned, whether you are willing to be owned by whatever. And this specific thing was, are you willing to be owned by your body? And I'd never actually looked at this. And so as I started looking at it, I had all these awarenesses around what I am with my body, which I thought I wasn't. So one of the awarenesses, which was really quite fascinating, was that I thought I was separating from my body, and I also thought that I wasn't actually in my body. And after looking at a few things and also looking at the questions that were asked in the book, and I can't remember what they were particularly, but I was like, yeah, cool. And then the question was, are you willing to be owned by your body? I'm like, yeah. And it was a total like yes with like really no point of view. I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, huh, that that's really odd. I never looked at that. I never considered that. I didn't even think I had a relationship, or that I had any questions around my body, or that my body was, that I really embodied my body, I guess, is the thing. And so then these other questions kind of came about with that. And it is so interesting where it's been like literally years. And then I started actually looking at, okay, actually when this shows up in my world, I do actually ask questions. There aren't things that I'm willing to do to my body that I know aren't kind to it. And then there was also this whole and looking at that, like I was starting to look at all the places where I did actually ask my body about things, and it may not be every 10 seconds, but it was a lot of it was actually being in the question around things to do with my body. Also with eating, also with exercise. There was this one day in particular back in the fall where I'd been sitting in front of my computer a lot and doing a lot of work sitting, and my body was like, okay, we have to get out and we have to go for a hike. And so I did. It was later in the day and I went for this hike, and I literally ran the whole hike. And it's funny because I hadn't been doing a lot of physical activity, so I was like, quote unquote, out of shape. But it didn't seem to matter. It didn't seem to be a problem. My body was just going, and I'm like, okay, we're going. And it was amazing, and I loved it, and I enjoyed it. And it was like, it's just so interesting what shows up. And so when you start looking at this, or playing with this question of like, what's right about me that I'm not getting? So that was one of the things that came out of it, was this whole experience, basically, that I was discounting that I actually have with my body. And I never thought I did, or I had bought the lie that I wasn't in actually communion with my body. And I actually do have, I have to say, I have a pretty amazing body. It lets me do all kinds of things. It lets me have a really strange diet too. I love sweets, and I eat a lot of sweets, and it asks for that, and I don't actually make myself wrong. I never have. I love donuts too, cakes, pastries, whatever, and I've never really made myself wrong, and so I get to enjoy all these super, super yummy things, and so it's like, yet still I had this thing where I didn't realize how much of a contribution me as a being is to my body, and the contribution that my body is to me. So this is quite a a lengthy sort of almost like story to show what can actually show up when you ask the question, what's right about me that I'm not getting? And so I've been asking this question for about a week, maybe a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. I don't quite remember. Time's not so relevant. But it's been about that time frame. And so this was one of the more noticeable things that have shown up, that has shown up in my world since asking that question, and not automatically going into the wrongness of me in anything. And it's really interesting how things show up, and how, and in the way that they never show up the way that you think they will, and everything is the opposite of what it appears to be, and nothing is the opposite of what it appears to be. And so it's this whole, so as you ask that question, you get to actually go into acknowledging you, which I know for me, I don't do a lot of, and could do so much more of, and how much we actually do dismiss us, how much we dismiss who we be and what we be in the world, and the contribution that we be in the world. And that when we look at things or create things, we probably forget us in the creation sometimes too. And so it really has all these different places and these different situations that show up in the world when we don't actually go to what's right about me that I'm not getting. And what would that change? And what does that change? I mean, I'm certainly noticing the experience I have with my body since acknowledging that I'm actually in it and I'm not separate from it in any way. And it's really that inclusion of you, and that inclusion of you, and that you and your body are part of that there isn't a separation. And so, and it was interesting, because just other things like, and these seem like so small and don't matter, and they don't, but it's just neat. Like, it's just neat how they show up, and it's just like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like the other day, my body was really, really craving some sugar, and I didn't really do anything about it. And then I was doing some work, and Carlina's like, hey, do you want a Coke? And I'm like, and my body's like, yeah, I've been asking for one. You've just been too lazy to get up and get it for me. And so it was just really happy to receive that, and it was, and my body was actually asking for it, and I was aware that it was asking for it. I just hadn't actually done anything about it. And so the awareness has even grown out of that. I have more awareness with my body, even more than I did before. And it was simply through that acknowledgement of, what's right about me that I'm not getting, and the acknowledgement of like, oh, I actually have this communion with my body that I thought I didn't. And it's just so interesting what we end up discovering by asking questions, and how things can just show up in a completely different way. And I would have never thought that by asking the question, what's right about me that I'm not getting, that this whole exploration with my body would show up. And so it is kind of exciting in what questions create, and what that can create in your world, and how much ease it creates, because you're taking the judgment off of yourself. And that's probably the biggest thing, is the question about what's right about me that I'm not getting really gets you into a space of not judging yourself anymore for who you be. And it puts you in the space of allowance of you. And that alone just creates the space for so many other things to show up in your life. And I really get that that's what many people are looking for, is just more space for themselves. And when you have space for yourself, you have so much allowance for other people as well. And that's where you start creating that ripple effect into the world, into the universe. By being the being that you are. And it's almost like you claim yourself. Claim seems like a weird word, but it is the acknowledgement, but it's also like the acknowledgement of like, oh wow, this is truly who I am. This is truly my being. And how much more can we play with that, and what else can show up in the world? And I'm so grateful for this journey of discovery. And I am really curious to your road of discovery. And what can, just asking one question like this throughout your day for the next 2 weeks, or the next week really, and what can that create? And how much fun can you have by not judging yourself anymore? And how much possibility and space can you create for you with this? And I would love to hear from you, and to hear how that can change your world, how it has changed your world, by just asking one question. And it's basically asking yourself not to judge yourself automatically, and just to see what else is possible that you never considered about you, and that you never were willing to acknowledge that you already are, and that you already do. And what else is possible in this space? What else is possible? And how much fun can you have? So my invitation to you is to play with what's right about me that I'm not getting. Play for it for the next week. Maybe next week even comment on this video on what that has created in your life. And how much change are you already being? And thank you so much for joining in. Thank you so much for playing. And we'll play again next week. Same time, same place. Awesome. See you later. Bye.